So this talk is probably, let's say, the most, the kind of the talk that I've done the most. So on my side, it looks like I'm just repeating things. I just hope that you're going to get something a bit new from it. And I try to make it very, let's say, simple, so that whatever the resources you have, in depending on the level, on the club you work with, you may have the ability to do something, let's say, a bit similar. Of a survey that we are running at the moment. So we started the survey a week ago. And if there are any people in the room that want to participate, as long as you work in a club context, feel free. It's easy to find it online. And the first
la encuesta está disponible online.
From this survey, we ask those people in clubs about what really matter when they monitor this return to play process, and what are the things that really matter to them, what matter a little bit or a lot. And what we can see, without surprise, what matters the most, of course, it's in purple, so on the right side. Diagnostic, of course. When you start to rehab a player, you need to know what was the injury. And then quickly you have function on the second level. That's function. So really understanding how the player is able to move as he comes back from his injury. And then we have here as well response to work done. And interestingly, there are things that those practitioners were not really rating as high, like for example, range of motion. That doesn't seem to be as important that looking at how the player responds. I was expecting strength to be strength. That's strength values, for example. So this is still important, but not as important again as the function and the response to the player. And again, that's coming from a survey that we sent to people to tell us how they work and what's important to them. So I think that's important to know first what people really need to follow when they rehab a player. That's probably the thing that we need to make sure we have enough information about as we progress. Okay. The other interesting thing with this survey was about that one is, do we have, let's say, a process that is what we say at all cost, and we need to follow the steps? Or we rather, and there's actually no one said that, so you can have a plan. But the thing, what looks important is that we're going to need to use subjective and objective criteria that we validate as we move on during the return to play process. And once we validate one phase, then we move to the second one. And of course, considering as well a lot the players' feedback. So I think what's very important from this survey, and that's completely obviously my view as well, is that nothing is set in stone, and it's really something that we need to adapt and to see how things progress. But to be able to adapt the things as well as we can, we need to have as many observables, values, measures that can help us to make those decisions. Could be more subjective or more objective values, and I'm going to give you some examples. So there's a bit of French in this slide as well, but I think that's fine for everyone. So typical, let's say, framework, you go through the injury. First phase, the healing phase, the reconditioning, that's really more like kind of typical physio type of work. Back on the pitch, individual, then back with the group, and then finally return to competition. And I'm going to show you a little bit how I've kind of been used to go through this process and collecting information at all levels. So the first level, of course, is just to find a way to get the training content sorted and organized. And those training content, or could be treatment, could be, again, could be the physio's job, but also the conditioning coach. I know in Spain you have a lot of kind of the el rehabilitador, the guy who does a little bit everything. But the idea behind that is using, and those days most of the team at least use, or you guys use a cloud could be at the extreme of having a proper athlete management system, which is obviously the top of the option, where you have a software that is dedicated to bring everything together. But to be honest, you could do that with Google Drive, and you also already have an ability to have one place where everyone can share. So physio has been doing treatment in the morning, puts it in the cloud. Conditioning coach wants to see what has been done before. He can look at the cloud and so on. So having the ability to put somewhere all those content, I think helps a lot, the collaboration between all the staffs. Then, of course, very quickly, we need to understand, and that was, again, part of the survey, the function. So whether it is strength, but only at least potential asymmetries or deficits from one leg to the other leg in terms of, again, range of motion, of movement. And for that, if I give you the example of the hamstrings, very simple test that, of course, we've been doing in Lille with the advices from Jordan. Look at, in this case, range of motion in a particular position when you get both influence of both legs. Instead of doing a typical isolated, just the Thomas test or an active leg straight raise, for example, in this case, you do a combination of both, but Jordan will talk more about that later. But super simple. You can, a lot of time, you can just look at the angles visually, and you will see that one leg has more range than the other. Of course, then you can use angles, and you can do it a bit more scientifically. You can also do the other test that Jordan calls la patada or el kick test, where, again, when you see the coordination between both legs, that tells you quickly if there is interconnection between the limbs. And that's also something that we've been using frequently during the return to play process to kind of say, okay, we can move on. If the player is able to do this kick test, for example, very quickly, that means doesn't have any fear, doesn't have any limitation from one side to the other, and we can move on. So simple test, more about the function in this case. Of course, then, if you want to do it a bit more scientifically, you put them into an Excel sheet, a radar, or whatever, so that you can compare progresses throughout the process. That's more about function, but starting easy. Then, of course, at some stage, you need to measure strength. So whether you use handheld manual, handheld dynamometer with your hands, you can use more sophisticated tools like an old board, for example. That's really on the hamstring. The good thing with an old board is that it can also be an exercise. And I'm not going to enter into whether Nordic exercise is the best or not, but it's one among others, you know. So I think that's handy because it's an exercise, but also a test at the same time. That's an example of player has just been gone through initial testing at the start of the season, got a bit stronger, did a few tests, which were not really testing, was just more as he was conditioning himself or doing some strength session during the season. Sometime we got a measure. Then he got injured. And then when he came back to injury, we were just able to see that he was back to his initial strength values. So simple, but the more data you have in bank, the easier to see where he is in comparison to his former values, initial values. So whether, I'm not saying at all it should be always a given level or should be predictive of anything, but it's always nice to have values in bank that one day when you want to see where is he at when he comes back from injury, you know, and you can compare retrospectively. Now, if we want to go really, really further into defining thresholds, that's really another level in terms of using not only technology, but in this case, using machine learning. That's the stuff that we're doing with my work at Kitman Lab, where we have hundreds of data, hundreds of hamstring injuries, hundreds of tests, and we're kind of looking at thresholds that may be indicative of higher risk or not. Of course, strength is only one small factor of all the factors related to injury, of course. But in this case, the machine learning model tells you if you're below than 400 Newton on that test, the risk is increased. As simple as that. We don't have yet the same machine learning models for the Jordan test, for example. But that's a project, depending on your range of motion. And there's a lot of things like that. So that will be just given an example of how we can push the things further with the use of technology and data. But again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. And then, of course, in terms of testing, force plates are, to me, of course, the gold standard. Because if you're doing just a counter-movement jump, for example, you're measuring way more than just a jump height. You measure the way the jump is actually carried away with the force plate. We look at the eccentric phase of the jump, which is also, you can calculate the ratio. So it gives you more information about the quality of the jump rather than jumping height. And if you have a dual platform, you can also look at right to left the push-up phase, the landing phase. So it gives you a lot of information. The thing is that's obviously pretty expensive. So you have other options, like you have the My Jump app that you know, pretty. I think it costs almost nothing. You get jump height, you get a little bit of that, but it gets a bit harder to get, for example, right to left leg. But it's a better than nothing. Again, to have at least reference value, so that when the player comes back, you know where he was at, and then you can make comparisons. Okay, so that's about the strength and the asymmetries and the range of motion, these kind of things. Then, of course, as soon as the player comes back on the pitch, important to monitor his work. And this is where, of course, the use of GPS is obviously very, very helpful. But before GPS, you can just start to have just the time the player is on the pitch. That's no technology to start with. And in this case, red bars are the time the player has been training, and all the blue bars are the games. So as you can see, he's been through a couple of games, got injured. Then here you see just how he started to build up in red after the break, started to build up training again. There's a little, very small here, blue dot. That means in that case, that's cool. He managed not to play a full match straight, but he played, in this case, 18 minutes. So we kind of manage his competitive time so that he doesn't start too strong. Then back on training a little bit more, and then he got his
Vuelta de nuevo al entrenamiento
so better than nothing, just track the time, training versus competition time. Of course, then we go further with the actual use of the GPS. And then I think everyone in the room will have his own view about how to present those data. The way I think most people do, we track the different typical metrics. Could be high speed running, could be the speed, the max speed that is reached, could be accel, decels. Well, that's one thing, again, about the progression. But I think what matters to me the most probably is this example where we have consistently, well, if I take the example of that one, that's using player load, which is an overall measure of the player movement. Not very specific, but gives you he's been moving a lot or not. What matters, again, is in gray, light gray, this is the typical load of a typical microcycle of the player. So if this player was to be training healthy with the group, he will be having this at day plus 1, day plus 2, day plus 3, day plus 4. That's maybe a -2 or minus 3. So this is the load he has, the habits he's used to go through during a normal week. And the current week, when he's coming back from injury, that's in dark gray, this is his actual training. So he trained twice, I would say, roughly as he's used to. But then, for various reasons, we were not able to load him again a third or a fourth day in a row. So when you finish the week, you say, because in this case he has trained either individually or partially with the group, but you finish the week and you say, he has not done yet a full training week in terms of load. And that's an argument for us to discuss with the coach to say, even if you feel that he may be able to train, bear in mind that he doesn't have the typical load in the legs. So either we don't even play him because we want him to go through another week, or if ever he has to play, maybe he just plays 15 minutes, for example, you know? So I think this is a basic way, but important to discuss with coaches about how much a player has been training or not. If we were to show just this graph to the coach, that's important for us to look at the progression. Okay, we're building up the load, but the coach doesn't have any clue if this is enough or not to play. But if you put it in the context of a typical week, then the coach can understand that he has not trained as he is supposed to be. Okay? That's about GPS. And talking about technology, now we've been using a lot as well this system called the Player Maker. So that's another level in the technology and the cost. But you get, as you see, look at the shoes of the players. They have accelerometers through this band attached to the boots. And with this, we get the typical GPS metric, so how much they run and so on. But better than that, we have contact with the balls at different levels as well. So easy contact, strong contact, number of kicks, the speed of the ball, the speed of the kicks. And again, now we've been playing from a day to another day, looking at the number of touches, the number of ball release, the number of kicks, so that we don't only quantify and build up the running, but also quantify and build up the touches and the passes. Maybe after an hamstring, might not be that important. But if you come back from an adductor or groin issues, that's probably important as well to be able to quantify the volume of touches and passes. So that's, to me, bringing again to another level the monitoring and the technology when we monitor the return to play. But again, important to have also what is a normal training in terms of number of passes. What is a normal game? So that as for a strength test, you also have a normal amount of passes. And interestingly, most of the time, when you rehab a player on your own, if you're just individually with one player, you just ending up doing a lot of passes, more than during a typical training, because you're just alone with him and you just pass. And that's interesting to know that sometimes we probably don't need to do that much in the end. Keep on with now tracking fitness. So that's something pretty easy. If you have the ability to run a maximal test at some stage, if it's a long injury, okay, maybe that might be interesting. But what I'm doing often is I'm just using a submaximal run, could be 5 or even 4 minutes, always the same speed, and we look at heart rate response. So I think that's basic physiology. If you're always running at the same speed, but then heart rate goes down, looks like you're improving your fitness. If heart rate goes up, you might actually having the opposite effect. So in this case, again, that's an example of a player in Lille this season. But I started to do that like when I was coaching handball in 2006, 2007. So that's something that carried from handball. Did that in Qatar. Then I worked in Australia, did it as well in Australia. So that's really the test that I've been able to kind of carry away everywhere because it's just so simple. 4, 5 minutes, 12. So it's kind of a warm-up. And you just look at how heart rate changes. So in this case, you see the player, first point back from pre-season, trains in July, August, same speed, heart rate decreases. That means he's improving his fitness, so he's getting better. Stays the same, roughly. Gets injured by the end of mid-September, like a long injury. Then for various reasons, we did not test him again. Then he had maybe, I think, COVID as well, back to 81. So at this time, mid-December, his heart rate response was even worse than when he came back after pre-season. So that just shows how deconditioned he was through all the bad luck he had, the injury, the COVID, and so on. And then train again, and he was back after not even 2 months. He was back to where he was when he was likely super fit at the end of the pre-season. Super simple, and again, that's very, very handy. So that's something we do even with healthy players, but even more during the return to play, so that we can track if fitness is going in the right direction and if we need to work more on fitness or not. Okay, and before we go and really release players to full training, full speed, we tend to do some running analysis. Again, pretty simple to implement. Difficult to do that for all players at the same time, of course. But every time we have the opportunity throughout the start of the season, we have, let's say, we just grab 2 or 3 players on the side of a training. Maybe, there's a 10-10, there is 2 players not playing, come with us, they do the sprint, they rotate, one day not qualified for the match or not selected. So we try to gather as much as we can for all the players, those typical running metrics. So, it's about really how the position, the legs, the position of the pelvic, the angles. And once we have that in a bank, once, again, the player is coming back from the injury, then we do it again and we can compare. So we've been doing this straight line as well. You don't really see everything, but there's a little bit of a curve here. And again, sometimes just with the eyes, you can just see if the strides are symmetric or they have the same type of stride, or you can go further again using software and get through specific angles and so on if you want to make it a bit more, let's say, scientific. But yeah, that's typically the angle. Again, that's a lot of stuff that Jordan has done also. Then, of course, at some stage, then we use GPS again, but in this case, we use GPS live. So often you have the iPad, or with some system you have it on even on a watch. They give you the speed in direct live, so that we can really make sure that when we build up the speed after an injury, we build up again progressively. So of course, if you set up your distance and your zones, it's pretty easy to kind of guess what is going to be the speed of the player. You give him 10 meters, unlikely he runs more than 20. You give him 15, you give him 20, you know. But then sometimes players, they want to play, they want to push, or sometimes they don't want to push because they don't feel really fine. And that's very interesting to know, to have it at live. Say, okay, can you just push 28, for example, today? And the player will say, yeah, I'm pushing. And you look at, he's still at 26, 27. He doesn't want to push. So that's really a good information for you to know that he doesn't feel ready here, at least. Opposite, you just want to control, and they just keep pushing and say, maybe with the work we've done yesterday, we don't want you to go too fast. So having this information live is really helpful, especially when you want to manage the speed. And I think in this case, you have to go through GPS to really be able to to follow that. Then going a bit further into how much of those sprint and those speeds to implement. That's data we did on the PSG data like a while ago now. I said PSG data, and I have a picture of Madrid, but it's coming from 4 or 5 years of data from PSG. And we looked at the typical running sequences during a match. So in average, a wide defender does about 6 to 8 runs above 80% of his own maximal sprinting speed. 3 of those 8 are touching the 85% threshold, and there is 1 to 2 touching 90. So we have those, let's say, typical pills of sprints that we use also at some stage during the return to play as a way to say, okay, if you're going through those 6 to 8 sprints at this relevant speed, that means, first of all, you are able to do it, so there's no problem, but also you're kind of ready now to play a full match, at least if we look at those specific demands in terms of speed. And the last part of the return to play is about overall wellness and response to the overall training. So to make sure the athlete is going through the different phase with no complaints, that he's not getting too tired, that there is no risk of re-injury, for example. We use, again, the player maker in this case to track neuromuscular fatigue or status. So in this case, we're going through standardized runs, in this case, kind of box to box, okay? Always the same speed. In this case, it's 12 seconds to go from one box to the other. So it's roughly, they're gonna reach 22, 24 kilometers per hour. So it's high speed, but it's not crazy. And with the player maker, because before I was telling you, the accelerometer gives you the contact with the ball, the kicks, but also the accelerometer can give you the contact time. And once you have contact time, you have an idea of how efficient the legs are and the player is, which means if it's always the same speed, but one day the contacts are pretty short, that means he's stiff and he's fresh. Another context, contact times are getting longer, he's getting fatigued. So as simple as that, but because it's really standardized, we have kind of an idea of the freshness of the player during the return to play. And it happens often, especially when they come back from at least 2-3 weeks of injury, when they come back, contact times are pretty long because they've lost this ability and this stiffness. So we track that, and then we see how quickly that comes back to, again, baseline values. That's, I guess that I've told that for everything. It's really about having baseline values, whatever you use during the return to play, so that, again, you can compare with what was happening before. So that's an example where we use, again, this contact time. It's a ratio in this case. It's the velocity divided by the contact time. So when the ratio is high, it's good. And when the ratio is down, it's when you're losing the stiffness and you're getting a bit tired. So in this case, you see after a long injury, like even the player was already going down pretty, even like no relationship with the injury, but he was already getting down. After the injury, the ratio was pretty poor. And then when he came back, ratio went up, showing that he was recovering his stride quality and freshness. So this is about having an idea of an objective idea of how a player responds. And then, of course, in parallel to that, the easier is to go through typical wellness questionnaire. So either you do that pen and paper, use an app. Of course, we're using Kitman, so that's easy. So you have everything on the phone. Try to convince players to do it by themselves. Works, not always. We go and ask ourselves as well often. But you get a pretty consistent follow-up of how they feel after the sessions. And before I was telling you about using another level of machine learning to understand thresholds for Nordic strength, for example. We run studies as well to understand thresholds about, for example, changes in reported muscle soreness. And in this case, you see again that even a small increase, in this case, it's a Z-score, so it's a proportion of a standard deviation. So it's a bit complex, but it means that like slow increases in the reported muscle soreness is already related or associated with increased injury risk. That's the graph is about. In this case, when you have an increase in muscle soreness over a month in comparison to, again, historical data you have. So if for a month increased soreness goes up, risk of injury may increase as well. So this is not only for return to play, but this is a kind of a continuous kind of monitoring. But again, we apply this as well for during the monitoring process to make sure they don't get too sore, or we wait, maybe sometime we delay a session from a day to make sure they recover a little bit before we push, or we just change or modify the training session. So again, I put together in the talk not only the technology in terms of devices, but also technology in terms of the technology in terms of mathematics and analytics behind. A bit similar to muscle soreness, we have found also that decreases in sleep quality over a month were pretty tightly associated with increase in injury risk. In this case, again, it's a small changes. It's a change as a Z-score, so it's a pretty small drop in sleep quality, but again associated with injuries. Look, again, that's something pretty easy to implement, and that it's definitely worth monitoring to see how the player respond during training or the return to play. And once we have all those tests, whether I started with the range of motion, function, the strength, the speed, the wellness, once you put everything together, then you start to have a nice dashboard, so you can have an idea of how the player is responding, whether you can keep pushing or whether you'd better wait a couple of more days before you push again. So that's the idea of building those dashboards. And of course, that's something I did not talk about yet, but that's probably something, and I'm glad that Raoul is with us also, because I'm sure you're going to have to say something about that, is how the player feels himself as well, the trust he has in his ability to be able to go and give full effort. And that's something that we often tend to forget. We go, okay, Nordboard, strength, happy, speed, but this is also important. So that's something, of course, that needs to be embedded into this monitoring. So there's little technology behind that, but again, it's important to consider the feeling of the player. Okay, and that's a bit of a busy slide that comes from the survey that we are running at the moment. And in this case, I asked, and let's just look at one or two. If we look at that one, so the question was, how many times have you seen in your practice a player that actually started a match without, for example, having touched 90%? That's something that, as we said, that's probably something that we want. We want to do it like in the book. We want to make sure the player touched 90% as a way to validate the return process, and then he can actually play. And people admit, though in this case you have never, so like a big proportion say normally they do it well and they really validate, but you still have a big proportion saying that sometimes, often, and even some guys say that always. So there's still a lot of people, they send players to play a full match without having met those typical criteria. And that's the truth. So what's the reason behind that? I don't know. Maybe you don't have technology to really make sure you touch 90, or you just don't believe it's important, or I don't know, the coach has too much to say, and as soon as he sees the player in the club, he says, okay, bring it to me, and he put him on the bench. I don't know. But the reality is that let's say the ideal scenario, the practices that I was kind of showing you before, the truth is that there's still a lot of people that send players without having validated those criteria. And that doesn't mean that they get more injured either. So we have to be kind of flexible and understand that there never has to be like this in the book. This question about the 90% that was for like short injuries. If we go for more severe injuries, do that change a little bit? Yeah, maybe. There is, let's say, for longer injuries, then in this case, there will be less. People will be tempted to test more max speed because they believe it's more important. So that might be also related to the severity of the injury. But that's the idea. Overall comment with this slide is that it's not always as nice and as clean as we would like for many reasons. Okay, so to summarize, so overall, data technology, of course, it's only a part of the process. Is that because you have technology that you're going to do the things well? As we said from the start, that was my chart pie. People were saying that the most important is to be adaptable and adapt to see how things are progressing, and you don't need to have a set standardized protocol, but rather have in mind the process and where you want to go, and then adapt as things evolve. But to be able to adapt, my point was, the more data you have, the better and the easier to adapt. When I say hardware versus software, so hardware, strength device, software could be an athlete management system, or your Google Cloud, for example. And then, of course, it's always a mix between qualitative and quantitative information. The strength, the ROM, that's definitely quantitative. Qualitative about the quality of the stride, the movement, the pain. And so it's really a mix of all this information. And the more you put them together, the easier or the better you can actually support the decision. And decision, I'm talking about moving to one phase to another, or allowing the player to play 30, 50, or 90 minutes, which can make a big difference in his re-injury rate risk as well. Yes, and I think I'm done. And that was just another segue to the questionnaire that I mentioned. So if anyone wants to participate, it would be nice. It's going to be open a few more weeks anyway. I'm done with that. Thank you. And open for question, I'm sure. Thank you.